The boy wasn't supposed to be there. Security personnel shouted as he sprinted across the restricted tarmac, weaving between flashing lights and roaring jet engines. The sun was just beginning to rise behind the terminal, casting long orange shadows across the concrete. And at the far end of the runway, a sleek Gulfstream G650 was already rolling into position, engines whining, preparing for takeoff. And that's when he screamed, "Stop, don't fly, your plane has been sabotaged." The words pierced through the morning air like an emergency siren. For a moment, everything paused, pilots, ground crew, even the impatient security officer trailing behind him. The boy stumbled to a halt just 30 yards from the jet arms, waving wildly as he gasped for breath. Inside the cabin, billionaire industrialist Robert Thornton was sipping his espresso, reviewing the day's itinerary. The sudden screech of the intercom jolted him upright. "Sir, we've got a situation on the ground," the co-pilot said. "A teenager just ran onto the runway. He's yelling something about sabotage." Thornton raised an eyebrow. "Sabotage affirmative. He's saying the aircraft's been tampered with." The billionaire looked out the window and spotted the boy, a wiry teenager with windswept hair, wearing a worn-out Aviation Academy hoodie, far too large for his frame. He looked out of place, terrified, but not crazy. Thornton narrowed his eyes. "Get the tower. Tell them to hold the takeoff. Now!" The plane rolled to a halt just seconds before clearance. On the ground, 2 TSA officers tackled the boy to the tarmac, cuffing his wrists and yanking him to his feet. "You don't understand," the boy shouted. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm trying to save him." They didn't listen. He twisted in their grip, his voice ragged. "Please, just check the underbelly panel. The wiring's been bypassed. There's a pressure trigger under the portside landing gear." One of the mechanics nearby flinched. "Wait, what did he say?" he muttered to his partner. Thornton stepped off the stairs of the plane with practiced calm, his sharp grey suit unbothered by the commotion. He walked straight toward the boy. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jake." The boy panted. "Jake Mitchell." Thornton stared into the kid's eyes. They weren't manic, they were certain, desperate but focused. "Why should I believe you, Jake Mitchell?" Jake's voice broke, but only slightly. "Because my father died trying to warn you, and I won't let the same thing happen again." 3 days earlier, Jake Mitchell sat on the roof of his mother's apartment building, a rusted pair of binoculars pressed to his face and a sketchpad resting on his lap. He wasn't spying. Not really. He was watching the planes. The old municipal airport across town was nothing fancy. Mostly small charters and a few private jets, but to Jake it was sacred ground. Every takeoff and landing felt like poetry in motion, a conversation between sky and steel. He logged every plane's make, model, and serial number like a personal religion. He didn't just love aviation. He breathed it. His mother, Sarah, called up from the window. "Dinner in a sec," he shouted back, eyes still glued to the descending tail of a Citation CJ4. A part of Jake was still trying to hold on to something bigger than the sky, his father, Thomas Mitchell. Former Air Force pilot, test pilot. The man who'd taught Jake the names of clouds before the boy even knew his multiplication tables. But Thomas wasn't coming back. He'd died 2 years earlier in what had officially been labeled a mechanical failure mid-test flight. Jake never bought the explanation. Neither did his mother. But there was no lawsuit, no further inquiry, just a sealed report and a folded flag. Since then, Jake had poured himself into aviation like it was the only way to keep his father's memory from slipping away. Every manual he could find, every YouTube flight simulator, every classified diagram someone carelessly posted online. He was only 15. But he knew enough to notice things, and that weekend he had noticed something. It started with a shadow. Jake had biked out to the chain-link fence near Hangar 9, where most of the high-security private jets were stored. He'd hidden behind a row of weather-worn maintenance crates, binoculars trained on a sleek Gulfstream GE650 that had flown in earlier that day. The crew was minimal, the ground team efficient, but something felt off. A man with a toolbox approached the plane at twilight, no uniform, no ID badge. He didn't follow any known maintenance protocol. He didn't even look around. Just crouched under the fuselage and disappeared for a few minutes. Jake's heart pounded. He scribbled notes, sketched the man's features, and snapped a blurry photo through the chain-link fence. Then the man vanished into a service vehicle and drove off. Jake waited another 10 minutes, then did something insane. He slipped through a gap in the fence and crept toward the jet. No one saw him. He didn't touch anything, he just looked. And what he found chilled him to his bones, a small foreign module wedged beneath a rear access panel, something that didn't belong on a civilian aircraft. He had no way of knowing exactly what it was. But he knew what it wasn't: standard equipment. He ran home in the dark, the image burned into his brain like a scar. His father once told him, flying isn't just freedom, it's trust. The moment you betray that trust, people die. Jake wasn't going to let that happen again. And he'd just seen enough to know someone was about to. The next morning, Jake didn't go to school. He couldn't sit through algebra or pretend to care about cafeteria pizza while knowing someone might board a plane that had been rigged to kill. His mother thought he was at the library. He often spent Saturdays studying aviation manuals anyway, but Jake had a different plan. He biked back to the airport with his sketchpad, his binoculars, and a flash drive containing everything he'd logged the night before: the blurry photo of the mystery mechanic, the timestamps, his father's old maintenance schematics, and his own analysis. But he didn't just want to observe anymore. He needed someone to listen, and the only person who might take him seriously was the one boarding that Gulfstream, Robert Thornton. Jake had done his research. Thornton wasn't just rich, he was dangerous in the way powerful people could be without even trying. CEO of Thorntix Aerospace, he'd made his fortune manufacturing parts for military and private aircraft. His name was stamped on more turbine blades and hydraulic systems than Jake could count. And now Thornton was in town, scheduled to fly out that very afternoon. Jake's father had once met Thornton, briefly, a flight symposium years ago. Thomas had spoken highly of him afterward, not as a businessman, but as a man who listened when pilots talked. That memory was all Jake had to go on. So he waited and watched. From the edge of the security fence, Jake timed every movement of the ground crew. He clocked their lunch breaks, their fueling schedule, and the small gap between runway patrols. The exact moment when someone could theoretically cross undetected. He didn't plan to use that window until the ground crew did their final checks and the jet's engines began to warm. Until he saw Thornton, grey-haired, sharp-eyed, coffee in hand, boarding the plane like he was invincible. That's when Jake's body moved before his brain caught up. He slipped through the gap. He ran, fast, toward the aircraft across the tarmac, heart pounding in his ears louder than the turbines. "Stop! Don't fly, your plane has been sabotaged." The words tore out of him like a siren. He didn't care if they tackled him. He didn't care if they arrested him. He didn't care if no one believed him. He cared about saving the man who could have been his father. And it worked. The plane didn't take off. Thornton heard him. And in the tense, breathless silence that followed, Jake stood panting in cuffs, looking up into the eyes of a billionaire who was about to ask him the question that could change everything. "Why should I believe you?" Jake swallowed hard. "Because no one believed my dad. And now he's dead." The air on the tarmac hung heavy with tension. Security guards hovered, close hands still tight on Jake's shoulders. But Thornton didn't look at them. He looked only at the boy. "Your father's name?" he asked, voice low, measured. "Thomas Mitchell," Jake said. "Test pilot. He flew prototypes for Aerodyne until 2 years ago. You met him, once, at the Denver Flight Symposium." Thornton's eyes sharpened. Jake continued, desperate but steady. "He warned people about a faulty component in one of your contracts. Nobody listened. 3 weeks later, his test aircraft went down in a controlled dive he never pulled out of. They called it pilot error, but I found his notes, his recordings. He knew something was wrong." Thornton's jaw tensed, but his eyes didn't blink. "I remember him," he said finally. "Quiet, serious, thoughtful, had a grip like a vice." Jake nodded, barely able to speak now. "I found something last night. Under your jet. Not part of the original specs. Not FAA compliant. I don't know what it's wired to, but it looks like a delay trigger connected to the landing gear compression system. Maybe a fail-safe sabotage setup. My dad had seen one once, in military tests." The head mechanic, who'd been listening in stunned silence, stepped forward. "Sir, if what he's saying is even half true—" "Open it up," Thornton ordered. "Now." Jake was released from the guard's grip as the mechanics scrambled beneath the Gulfstream, prying open access panels, checking the gear bay, pulling back insulation foam. And then silence. A small square device glinted under the landing strut. Black matte housing, non-standard cabling, embedded like a parasite. Jake saw the moment they found it. The sharp gasp, the whispered curse. The flashlight beam trembling slightly. "Call bomb disposal," the lead mechanic said. "Right now." The security team began moving, this time with purpose. Pilots were evacuated, emergency protocols engaged. Thornton stood still, unshaken, watching the chaos unfold around him. Then he turned back to Jake. "You shouldn't have been able to get near this plane," he said. "You shouldn't have known any of this." Jake stood his ground. "I shouldn't have had to." The two stared at each other for a long beat. Then Thornton spoke again, this time not with skepticism, but with something closer to respect. "Walk with me." Jake hesitated, then followed as they stepped away from the crowd toward the edge of the hangar shadows. "I need to know everything you saw," Thornton said. "Start to finish. The man near the aircraft, the device, your father's files, all of it." Jake reached into his pocket, pulled out the flash drive, and held it up. "It's all here." Thornton took it gently, closed his fingers around it, then looked down at Jake with the kind of gaze few people ever saw from men like him, one not of command but of debt. "You may have just saved my life, Jake Mitchell." Jake didn't smile, didn't relax. Instead, he said what had been building in his chest for 2 years. "I just want someone to listen this time." Thornton nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure they do." The investigation began within the hour. Thornton's personal team locked down the Gulfstream and submitted the device to a neutral third-party aviation security lab. Bomb disposal confirmed what Jake had suspected, a pressure-triggered disruption unit cleverly disguised to look like part of the standard hydraulic assembly. Sophisticated, precise, lethal. Had the aircraft taken off the moment its wheels retracted, the device would have destabilized the avionics system mid-climb. There would have been no second chances. Jake sat in a grey briefing room inside Thornton's private hangar. An untouched bottle of water sat on the table beside him. Across from him, Thornton leaned forward, studying the teen like a data stream he couldn't quite decrypt. "You said your father left notes." "Proof?" Thornton asked. Jake nodded and pulled out a worn composition notebook from his backpack. The corners were frayed pages, filled with diagrams, annotated flight records, and margin notes in his father's meticulous handwriting. At the center was a page flagged in red ink, G650, cross-check fuselage junctions for thermal anomalies. He kept warning about parts being switched without logging. Jake explained. Cheap substitutions, tampered black box configurations. He tried to report it, but the higher-ups ignored him, or worse, buried it. Then his plane went down during a routine climb test. No ejection, no beacon. Thornton turned the pages slowly, his brows furrowed deeper with each line. "You think it's the same people?" he asked. Jake nodded. "Same tech, same pattern, but this time they tried to silence you." Thornton was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood. He walked over to the window, watching his grounded aircraft shimmer in the sun like a sleeping predator. "I've spent 3 decades building an empire on speed and control," he said. "But I never imagined someone would try to hijack that from underneath me." He turned back to Jake. "And you, a 15-year-old kid, cracked it in a night." "I just knew what to look for," Jake said. "My dad taught me." Thornton nodded slowly. "And saved me through you." He picked up the phone. "Get me Reynolds." "No, not the assistant, the captain. I want a sweep of all our hangars. And tell Victor Reeves he doesn't leave town until I speak with him in person." Jake blinked. Victor Reeves, my head of security, old family friend, only a handful of people knew my flight schedule. If someone leaked intel to sabotage my aircraft, they'd have had access to my manifest. Thornton hung up and looked Jake in the eye. "You just rattled a very deep tree, son." Jake frowned. "So, what happens now?" Thornton gave a faint smile. "Now we find out who tried to kill me, and why." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek titanium card with a silver logo embossed on it, Thorntick's Private Access. He handed it to Jake. "This gets you into my campus, my R&D lab, flight simulators, even our real training aircraft. I want you working with us, every day after school weekends, whatever it takes." I'll cover tuition, housing if needed. I owe you that. Jake stared at the card, speechless. Thornton leaned down, his voice softer now. But more than that, I want you to fly. Not just because you're your father's son, but because it's in you. I can see it. The sky never really lets go of people like us. Jake looked down at the card, then back up at the man he had once only known through headlines. And for the first time in 2 years, he felt something other than grief. He felt lift. The next morning, Jake could barely sit still. He hadn't slept much. His mind had been flying loops all night, replaying every word Thornton had said, every sketch in his father's notebook, every pulse of fear that now felt like momentum. But beneath the buzz was something unfamiliar: hope. Sharp, bright, heavy with meaning. His mother, Sarah, stood in the doorway of his room, arms folded, brow raised. You want to tell me why there's a news van outside our apartment building asking about a boy hero who saved a billionaire's life? Jake looked up from his desk, cheeks already turning red. I might have done something. Big. She stepped in, crouched down, her expression softening. Jake, what happened? So he told her. Everything, about sneaking into the hangar, about the device, about yelling on the runway, about Thornton, about the card in his pocket, and about Dad. Sarah didn't speak for a long time. Her hands trembled as they reached for the notebook, the same one she'd tucked away a dozen times too painful to open. Now she flipped through its pages, like discovering a language she'd forgotten. Your father would have been terrified, she said at last, her voice catching. But so proud. Jake smiled. Thornton wants me to train with his flight program, he said. Full access. He's offering to sponsor me. Sarah blinked. You mean real flight school? Jake nodded. And more. He thinks whoever tried to kill him might have also had something to do with Dad's crash. Sarah's face hardened. Then you're not going alone. Jake blinked. Wait. What? If there's something bigger behind this, she said, standing tall, we're finding it out together. That afternoon, Thornton's driver picked them up and whisked them through private gates into the Thorntix Aeronautics campus, a sprawling complex nestled between forest and runway where cutting-edge aircraft were born. Jake's jaw dropped as they passed experimental hangars, wind tunnel labs, and a control tower taller than any building he'd ever seen in person. But none of it compared to what awaited him inside Hangar 14. A gleaming Cessna 172 Skyhawk, freshly polished and fitted with dual controls, stood in the center beneath industrial lights. It wasn't a jet. It wasn't exotic, but it was real, and today it would be his. Captain Reynolds, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a silver streak through her hair and the posture of someone who'd logged 20,000 flight hours, met him at the steps. You're Jake, she said, the kid with the instincts of a test pilot and the nerve of a Marine. Jake shrugged. I just saw what others didn't. Reynolds grinned. That's called being a pilot. Within minutes they were in the air. Jake's hands trembled on the yoke at first, but Reynolds coached him through every movement. The headset hummed with her calm voice and the distant buzz of control tower chatter. He climbed, banked, corrected, all with a sense of inherited memory, as though the aircraft itself recognized his bloodline. He wasn't dreaming anymore. He was flying. When they landed, Thornton was waiting on the tarmac with a folder in hand. Thought you should see this, he said, handing Jake a set of printed photos. They were stills from airport security footage. The man Jake had seen near the aircraft. Zoomed, enhanced, face identified. Jake's stomach dropped. It was Victor Reeves, Thornton's longtime head of security. You said only a few people had access to your itinerary, Jake murmured. Thornton nodded grimly. And now we know which one of them betrayed it. He looked Jake square in the eye. You didn't just save my life, Jake. You exposed something we never would have seen coming. Jake tightened his grip on the photos. If Reeves was involved in this, then he may have had something to do with my dad, too. Thornton nodded. Then we're not done. Behind them, the sun began to set, casting golden streaks across the runway. But Jake didn't feel the day ending. He felt something beginning. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling of the guest suite Thornton had arranged for him and his mother, just temporary, until they decided whether to move closer to the campus. The room was nicer than any hotel he'd ever seen. Plush sheets, soft lighting, silent temperature control. But Jake's thoughts were louder than any storm. The photo of Victor Reeves sat on the nightstand. His narrowed eyes, the same man who'd once shaken Jake's father's hand after a test flight. The same man who gave a somber, emotionless hug at Thomas Mitchell's funeral. Jake remembered his voice, calm, calculated, detached. He had spoken words of sympathy, but now they echoed as something else entirely. A lie. Jake rose from bed and tiptoed into the suite's lounge, where his mother sat cross-legged on the couch, sifting through his father's old maintenance logs. "You're up too," he whispered. She nodded. "I've been thinking, if Victor really orchestrated what happened to your father, there has to be more. Paperwork, email chains, deleted files." Jake sat beside her. Dad was careful. He encrypted most of his notes. If there was something bigger, he would have left a trail. Sarah looked at him. "Then we follow it." The next morning, Thornton invited them both to a private breakfast at his office overlooking the test airstrip. His expression was grim. "I tried contacting Victor. He's gone. Left his house last night. Didn't show up for his debriefing this morning. No calls, no messages. His badge access has been disabled, but he's vanished." Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. Thornton continued, "If he's running, it means one thing: he knows we're closing in." Jake exchanged a look with his mother. Sarah leaned forward. "Before my husband's final flight, he mailed a package to a friend, Captain Ethan Hale, retired pilot. The box was returned to our home 2 weeks after the crash, unopened. We stored it unopened for a long time. I think it's time we opened it." Thornton nodded. "Go. Take my driver." Within an hour, they arrived back at their apartment. Sarah reached into the top of her closet and pulled out a dusty, unopened brown parcel. Jake held his breath as she sliced it open. Inside, a small hard drive, a handwritten letter, a USB key with a red mark on the side, a map of the Thornticks testing grounds from 2 years ago. Jake read the letter aloud. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it home. I found something during my last test flight. Something someone tried to bury. Don't trust internal security. I've hidden a log of the flight and a copy of the maintenance alterations. Victor Reeves is not who he pretends to be." Jake's voice caught on the last sentence. "If something happens to me, protect Jake. Keep him close to the sky." Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek. Jake clenched the flash drive in his fist. They plugged it into a secure laptop Thornton's team provided. Files unfolded like blooming Fireflight telemetry audio logs, engine schematics, metadata from erased black box reports. One folder stood out: Operation Phoenix. Thornton reviewed the files with them remotely via a secure call. "This is a cover-up," he said darkly. "Your father was right." "But why?" Jake asked. "Why kill a test pilot? Why sabotage your plane?" Thornton was quiet for a moment, then said, "Because Phoenix wasn't just a plane. It was a weapons platform, a militarized drone project. I shut it down 2 years ago, or so I thought." Sarah's voice was sharp. "Are you saying Victor kept it alive behind your back?" "I'm saying he may have had help. Government contracts, rogue manufacturers, investors who saw profit in war more than progress." Jake stood, the fire in his chest rising. "I want in, all the way." Thornton nodded slowly. "Then gear up. You're not just a pilot in training anymore, Jake." He leaned forward. "You're the reason this secret won't stay hidden." 2 days later, Jake found himself standing in a hangar older than the others, tucked behind the newer buildings on Thornton's sprawling campus. This one wasn't part of the public tour. It didn't have signs or company branding, only a faded number stenciled on the steel hangar 3A. Captain Reynolds met him at the door. "Ready to see how deep the rabbit hole goes?" she asked. Jake nodded, his face set with determination. Inside, beneath dusty tarps and dim lights, sat the stripped remains of an experimental aircraft, sleek, angular, built for speed and stealth. The side panel still bore its name in faded paint, PX-117 Phoenix. Reynolds pulled off the tarp, completely revealing mangled wiring, scorched metal, and an engine housing that had clearly seen trauma. "This is what your father died flying," she said quietly. "I recovered it myself after the crash, but Victor intercepted the official records, filed false mechanical reports, buried it all." Jake swallowed. "Why didn't you say anything? I didn't have proof." "Until now." She handed Jake a folder. Inside were matching documents to the USB drive his father had left behind. Same components, same anomalies, same hand-drawn notations in the margins. And one more thing, a second name. Garrett Lane subcontractor, former military, now CEO of a consulting firm linked to off-the-books defense deals. Thornton joined them. A few minutes later, his jaw clenched. Lane and Victor were working together. It wasn't just sabotage, it was control. They wanted me out of the way so they could resurrect Phoenix. Only this time without oversight. Jake's heart pounded, so they used the same trick. Quiet pilot. Isolated test. Make the crash look like pilot error. Reynolds nodded grimly, but they didn't count on a kid with his dad's eyes. Thornton's phone buzzed. He answered, listened, then turned to them. They just tracked Victor's signal. He's back in town, using one of our old airstrips. Hangar 7, 20 miles east. Looks like he's trying to flee with hard drives. Jake stepped forward. Then let's go get him. Reynolds raised a brow. You planning to fly there? Jake didn't flinch. With supervision. She smirked. You're your father's son, all right. Minutes later, Jake was in the cockpit of a Thorntix Scout, a light, fast, two-seater surveillance craft with Reynolds beside him. The runway cleared. The tower gave them priority. As the wheels lifted off the tarmac, Jake felt the sky rush to meet him, not like a stranger this time, but like a long-lost friend. The 30-minute flight felt like 10. When they reached Hangar 7, a convoy was already closing in on the runway below Thornton's private security, and two black SUVs from a federal task force tipped off by Simone Carter. Yes, that's Simone Carter, the civil rights chief who now owed Thornton a favor. Jake circled once, then brought the plane in low and smooth. By the time they touched down, Victor Reeves was in handcuffs, silent sullen, caught in the act of uploading encrypted files to a private satellite link. The flash drives in his bag matched the ones Jake's father had once carried. Thornton stepped out of the SUV and walked straight up to him. You should have known better, Victor. Victor's eyes flicked to Jake, and you should have ignored the kid. Jake didn't reply. He didn't need to. Because this time someone listened, and this time the right people paid attention. Back at the campus, Jake stood beside the scorched wreckage of the PX-117 watching as forensic analysts catalogued the final pieces of evidence. Reynolds approached quietly. You just rewrote the end of your father's story, she said. He didn't die in silence. He died warning the world, and now they'll hear him. Jake didn't respond immediately. He ran his hand along the cool metal of the aircraft's skin. I want to do more, he said finally. Not just fly, investigate, expose. Stop this before it happens to someone else. Reynolds nodded slowly. Then we'll train you for that too. Jake looked toward the sky where the first stars of evening were beginning to appear. His dad once told him, the sky tells stories if you learn how to listen. Now Jake was ready to tell them too. The press called him the kid who grounded a billionaire's jet. But the headlines missed the real story. Jake didn't want fame. He wanted the truth. And now that Victor Reeves was in custody and the Phoenix program exposed truth had finally taken flight. But the deeper they dug, the more tangled the story became. Thornton's internal auditors uncovered falsified budget trails, millions siphoned into shell companies linked to Garrett Lane. The subcontractor had used dummy corporations to bankroll the resurrection of Phoenix, intending to sell it on the black market as a militarized drone platform. And Victor, he wasn't just a silent partner. He was the linchpin coordinating fake maintenance reports, reassigning test pilots, and manipulating flight data. The crash that killed Jake's father had been a test run, not a tragedy. But a message: stay silent. Jake's father hadn't stayed silent, and neither would Jake. 1 week after Reeves' arrest, Thornton called a press conference. The media lined the runway outside Thorntix HQ lights, flashing reporters pushing forward. But it wasn't Thornton who stepped up to the mic first. It was Jake. Nervous but unshaken, he began, My name is Jake Mitchell. My father was Thomas Mitchell, a test pilot. He died 2 years ago, and until now, most people thought it was an accident. He looked down for a second, then back up. But it wasn't. He discovered something dangerous, and someone tried to silence him. He paused, the breeze catching the edge of his notes. When I warned Mr. Thornton not to board that plane, I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying to keep someone else from disappearing the way my dad did. And today we're here to say we won't disappear anymore. The crowd was silent, hanging on his words. Then Thornton stepped forward and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. Because of this young man's courage, he said, "We're creating the Thomas Mitchell Aviation Integrity Initiative, a watchdog coalition of engineers, whistleblowers, and pilots, to protect the people who risk everything to keep us in the sky." Reporters asked a flurry of questions, but Jake only answered one. "Will you be flying again?" someone shouted. Jake smiled. "I never stopped." In the weeks that followed, Jake began flight training full-time under Captain Reynolds. But it wasn't just about takeoffs and landings anymore. It was about ethics systems and trust, the kind his father believed in. Thornton gave Jake a permanent spot in the R&D mentorship program and even offered Sarah a consultancy role on family impact initiatives. Because strong pilots come from stronger homes, he said. Sarah hesitated at first, but then she remembered Thomas's words. "Someday Jake will fly farther than I ever did, and I want the world ready for him when he does." One evening, Jake returned home to find a small package waiting on the doorstep. No return address. Inside, a flight patch embroidered with the name PX-117. A handwritten note. He was one of the good ones. "I wish I had listened." E.H. Jake stared at the initials. Ethan Hale, his father's old squadmate, the one who'd gone quiet after the crash. Maybe the silence hadn't been betrayal but fear. Now it was breaking. That night, Jake sat in the hangar with the Cessna 172, his hand resting on the yoke. Above him, the stars blinked like secrets waiting to be uncovered. Reynolds stepped in quietly. "You good?" Jake nodded. "I just keep thinking, if I hadn't yelled that day." "You did," she said simply. "That's all that matters." He looked up. "There are more secrets, aren't there?" "Always," she replied. "But now you've got wings and a voice. And trust me, that's a dangerous combination for anyone who prefers shadows." Jake smiled softly. The sky didn't feel so far anymore. Now it felt like home. They tried to silence a boy by ignoring his voice. They didn't realize he'd speak louder. Jake Mitchell never asked to be a symbol. He didn't climb into that cockpit looking for glory. He didn't shout across a runway for fame. He did it because he saw something wrong and refused to look away. That's where real courage begins. Not with medals, not with microphones, but with a choice. To stand, to speak, to risk being unheard just to make sure someone else is safe. This wasn't just a story about a boy and a billionaire. It was about what happens when truth refuses to stay grounded. Jake didn't just uncover a conspiracy. He reopened a case they tried to bury. He gave his father back his honor. He gave the future a new kind of flight path. And now it's your turn. Drop a comment below. Truth flies highest. Let them know that voices like Jake's still matter, because maybe one day someone will need yours. Share this story with a friend who doubts that one person can make a difference. Subscribe for more stories where the underestimated rise the hidden is revealed and silence becomes action. Because you don't need a badge to tell the truth. You don't need wings to rise above fear. You just need one moment of unshakable clarity. And when it comes, shout, run, act, fly. The sky is listening.